They called her the coffee cart lady the moment she started her shift at Riverside General Emergency Department. Said she probably knew more about latte foam than life-saving procedures, but when the ambulance sirens wailed and chaos erupted in Trauma Bay 3 and her coffee apron fell away, revealing the faded tactical medic patch beneath her scrubs, the entire room froze because those weren't just decorations, and she wasn't just another hospital volunteer. She was the reason half the soldiers in the 82nd Airborne were still breathing, and why a convoy ambush in Helmand Province became a legendary rescue mission. Instead of a massacre, want to know what really happened when the worst mass casualty event in the city's history hit, and why 3 arrogant residents learned that sometimes the most qualified person in the room is the one nobody expects. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what you think makes a real hero. Let's dive into a story that will change how you see the quiet people around you forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 10 years, Dr. Elena Vasquez had been living a carefully constructed lie, not the kind that hurts people, but the kind that protects them from a truth too heavy to carry. She'd traded her combat boots for comfortable sneakers, her tactical vest for a cheerful volunteer apron, and her battlefield medicine kit for a simple coffee cart that she wheeled through the halls of Riverside General Hospital every Tuesday and Thursday morning, serving lattes to overworked nurses and residents who barely noticed her presence. At 45, Elena moved through the hospital corridors with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to navigate chaos without adding to it. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail secured with a plain elastic band that had seen better days. She wore the standard volunteer uniform, a powder blue polo shirt and khaki pants that had been washed so many times they'd achieved that perfect softness that comes from years of faithful service. Her sneakers were white leather practical things that had replaced the steel-toed boots she'd worn for 8 years in places most people couldn't pronounce. What the hospital staff didn't know was that Elena Vasquez had once been Captain Elena Vasquez, United States Army Medical Corps, a combat medic who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, specializing in forward surgical procedures under fire. She'd earned her medical degree through the Army's Advanced Education Program and had spent the better part of a decade keeping soldiers alive in conditions that would have broken most people's minds and spirits. The transition to civilian life had been harder than any firefight she'd ever survived. The constant hypervigilance, the way her hands automatically reached for medical supplies that weren't there, the nightmares filled with the faces of those she'd saved and the fewer faces of those she couldn't. The Department of Veterans Affairs had diagnosed her with severe PTSD and recommended a gradual reintegration into medical practice. But Elena had chosen a different path. She'd let her medical license lapse, taken a job at a small clinic in rural Montana, and tried to forget that she'd ever been anything more than a small-town doctor. But forgetting proved impossible, and after 3 years of struggling with panic attacks triggered by the sound of helicopter rotors and the smell of disinfectant, she'd made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She'd moved to the city, taken a part-time volunteer position at Riverside General, and created a new identity for herself as simply Elena, the coffee cart lady who showed up twice a week with a smile and a perfectly brewed cappuccino. The hospital staff had grown fond of her over the years. She remembered everyone's coffee preferences, knew the names of the nurses' children, and had a seemingly endless supply of encouraging words for residents. Pulling their 3rd consecutive 12-hour shift, Dr. Amanda Pierce, the head of emergency medicine, had tried several times to convince Elena to consider nursing school, pointing out that she had an intuitive understanding of medical procedures that couldn't be taught. But Elena had always deflected these conversations with a laugh and a fresh cup of coffee. What Dr. Pierce didn't know was that Elena held advanced certifications in trauma surgery, field medicine, and combat life support that she'd performed emergency thoracotomies in the back of moving helicopters, and had once kept a soldier with a severed femoral artery alive for 47 minutes. While under enemy fire, using nothing but a tourniquet made from bootlaces and a piece of shrapnel as a makeshift surgical clamp. Residents at Riverside General had their own opinions about Elena. They saw her as a sweet middle-aged woman who'd probably never seen anything more traumatic than a paper cut, and treated her with the kind of patronizing kindness that medical professionals often reserve for civilians who don't understand the complexity of their work. Dr. Kevin Walsh, a third-year resident with an ego that exceeded his experience, had once joked that Elena probably thought CPR stood for coffee pour refresher, and the comment had become a running gag among the younger staff. Elena had heard these comments, of course, but she'd learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful response was no response at all. She'd smile, serve their coffee, and continue with her carefully constructed routine that kept her demons at bay and allowed her to feel useful without being responsible for life and death decisions that had once defined every moment of her existence. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as Elena wheeled her coffee cart through the familiar corridors of Riverside General, something felt different. There was a tension in the air that she recognized, a subtle shift in the rhythm of the hospital that spoke to instincts she'd tried hard to suppress. The emergency department seemed busier than usual, and she noticed that several staff members were glancing at their phones with expressions that suggested they were expecting news. Elena had learned to read these signs during her years in combat zones. The way people moved when they sensed danger, the subtle changes in voice patterns and body language that preceded moments of crisis. She'd hoped never to need these skills again, but they remained as sharp as ever, a part of her training that couldn't be unlearned or forgotten. As she approached the nurse's station with her cart loaded with fresh coffee and her usual collection of pastries, Elena noticed Dr. Pierce standing at the central desk, her expression serious as she spoke quietly into her phone. The conversation was brief, but Elena caught enough fragments to understand that something significant was happening in the city, something that would likely bring chaos to their emergency department. The morning had started like any other, but Elena Vasquez was about to discover that some identities couldn't be hidden forever, and that sometimes the past had a way of demanding to be acknowledged regardless of how carefully you'd tried to bury it. The coffee cart lady was about to become someone else entirely, whether she wanted to or not want to know. What happened when the city's worst disaster brought Elena face to face with the skills she'd spent 10 years trying to forget, and why the entire hospital staff would never look at her the same way again. Stay tuned for part 2, where everything changes and the quiet woman with the coffee cart becomes the most important person in the building. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The emergency department at Riverside General Hospital buzzed with the controlled chaos that defined a level 1 trauma center on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that particular shade of institutional white that made everyone look either exhausted or ill depending on the angle. The smell was a familiar cocktail of antiseptic industrial-strength coffee, and the faint metallic tang that seemed to permeate every hospital corridor, regardless of how often they were cleaned. Elena pushed her coffee cart through the maze of hallways that had become as familiar to her as the forward operating bases she'd once called home. The wheels squeaked slightly on the polished linoleum floor, a sound that had become part of the hospital's morning symphony, along with the distant beeping of monitors, the soft conversations of night shift staff preparing to hand over responsibilities, and the occasional overhead page that carried someone's name, followed by an extension number. The emergency department occupied the entire ground floor of the hospital's east wing, a sprawling collection of trauma bays, examination rooms, and support areas designed to handle everything from minor cuts to mass casualty events. The main corridor was wide enough for 2 gurneys to pass comfortably, flanked by rooms marked with numbers and color-coded signs that helped staff navigate quickly during emergencies. Trauma Bay 1 through 8 were reserved for the most serious cases, each equipped with state-of-the-art monitoring equipment, surgical supplies, and direct access to the hospital's blood bank. Elena knew every inch of this department, not because she'd been given a tour, but because she'd spent 2 years quietly observing, studying the layout, the protocols, the way staff moved during different types of emergencies. She'd watched trauma teams work through glass doors, noted which residents stayed calm under pressure, and which ones needed more guidance than they were willing to admit. It was habit more than curiosity, the same instinct that had kept her alive in places where knowing your environment could mean the difference between life and death. The nurse's station sat at the heart of the department, a circular desk surrounded by computer monitors, medical charts, and the endless paperwork that kept a modern hospital functioning. It was staffed around the clock by veterans like Nurse Patricia Kowalski, who'd been working emergency medicine for 23 years and had seen every possible variation of human crisis, and newer graduates like Nurse Jennifer Liu, who still approached each shift with a mixture of enthusiasm and barely controlled anxiety. Elena had learned their patterns over the past decade. Patricia preferred her coffee black with 2 sugars and always ordered extra when she was working a double shift. Jennifer liked vanilla lattes but switched to green tea when she was stressed about a difficult case. Dr. Robert Chun, the overnight attending physician, was addicted to espresso and had once confided to Elena that her coffee was the only thing that kept him functional during the 3 a.m. lull when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm even his considerable experience. Morning shift change was a carefully choreographed dance that Elena had witnessed hundreds of times. Night staff summarized patient status, handed over ongoing cases, and briefed their replacements on anything unusual that had occurred during the previous 12 hours. Day shift personnel reviewed charts, checked equipment, and prepared for whatever the next 12 hours might bring. It was a ritual that spoke to the continuity of care, the seamless transition from one team to another that ensured patients received consistent treatment regardless of which doctor or nurse happened to be on duty. Elena positioned her cart near the break room where staff could grab coffee between cases and began her usual routine, checking the espresso machine temperature, arranging pastries in neat rows, and reviewing her mental inventory of everyone's preferences. She'd learned that small gestures mattered in a place where people dealt with life and death decisions every day. A perfectly prepared latte or a fresh blueberry muffin could provide a moment of normalcy in the midst of chaos. The break room itself was a testament to the practical needs of healthcare workers. Mismatched chairs surrounded a table scarred by years of coffee cups and hurried meals. A microwave that had seen better days hummed in the corner next to a refrigerator covered with photos of staff members, families, vacation snapshots, and the occasional thank you card from a grateful patient. The walls were painted a soothing blue-green color that some hospital administrator had probably chosen for its calming properties, though Elena doubted anyone had time to notice the decor during a typical shift. Through the break room window, Elena could see the helicopter landing pad, where med flight crews brought the most serious cases directly from accident scenes. The pad was empty now, but she knew that could change in an instant, transforming the controlled routine of a normal morning into the organized chaos of a trauma response. She'd been present during several such arrivals and had noticed how the entire department shifted gears. When the overhead speakers announced an incoming helicopter, Dr. Amanda Pierce emerged from her office carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of someone reviewing information that required careful consideration. At 52, she moved with the confident efficiency of someone who'd spent her entire career in emergency medicine, first as a resident, then as an attending physician, and finally as department head. She'd earned her position through competence rather than politics and had the respect of everyone who worked under her supervision. Elena had observed Dr. Pierce during numerous crisis situations and had developed a professional admiration for her leadership style. She remained calm under pressure, made decisions quickly when necessary, and never asked her staff to do anything she wouldn't do herself. She also had an uncanny ability to spot potential problems before they became actual emergencies, a skill that Elena recognized from her own military training. The morning census showed 37 patients currently in the department, ranging from a construction worker with a lacerated hand to an elderly woman experiencing chest pain, the typical mix of cases that kept emergency departments busy. Most would be treated and released within a few hours. Some would be admitted to other departments for further care, and a few would require immediate intervention to save their lives. Elena had learned to read the rhythm of the department like a musical score. She could tell from the pace of conversations, the frequency of overhead pages, and the general energy level whether it was going to be a routine day or something more challenging. Today felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension that she couldn't quite identify, a sense that everyone was waiting for something, though she wasn't sure what. City of Millbrook had been fortunate in recent years avoiding the major disasters that periodically tested other urban medical centers. No significant industrial accidents, no terrorist attacks, no natural disasters that overwhelmed local resources. Riverside General's emergency department had developed a reputation for excellence, partly because they'd had the luxury of focusing on individual cases rather than mass casualty events. But Elena knew from experience that fortune was a fickle thing, and that preparation was more valuable than luck. She'd noticed that several senior staff members had been attending additional training sessions in recent months, reviewing protocols for multiple casualty incidents and updating their certifications in advanced trauma life support. It suggested that someone in hospital administration was taking seriously the possibility that their quiet streak might not last forever. As Elena arranged her supplies and prepared for the morning rush of coffee orders, she found herself unconsciously cataloging the department's resources, the location of emergency supplies, the quickest routes between trauma bays, and the subtle signs that would indicate when the routine morning was about to become something else entirely. She'd spent 10 years trying to forget these instincts, but they remained as sharp as ever, like a language she'd learned to speak fluently, but could never quite unlearn. And on this particular morning, they were telling her that change was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. Elena Vasquez had perfected the art of being invisible in plain sight over the past decade, a skill that served her well in the bustling environment of Riverside General, where being noticed often meant being questioned, and questions led to conversations she preferred to avoid. She moved through her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that consistency was the foundation of anonymity. Her coffee cart was meticulously organized, a reflection of military training that she couldn't quite shake even after 10 years of civilian life. The espresso machine occupied the center position, flanked by containers of various coffee beans arranged not alphabetically but by frequency of use, the most popular blends within easy reach, specialized orders positioned where she could access them without disrupting her workflow. Beneath the main surface, she kept backup supplies organized in clear containers, labeled with her own shorthand system that looked random to casual observers, but made perfect sense to someone trained to maintain equipment under pressure. The medical supplies were hidden in plain sight, disguised as cart maintenance equipment. What appeared to be cleaning supplies actually included sterile gauze packets, hemostatic agents, and emergency medications that had no business being on a coffee cart. But Elena had learned that the difference between life and death often came down to having the right supplies in the right place at the right time. Her reasoning was simple. She was going to be in a hospital. She was going to be prepared for medical emergencies, even if her official role was limited to beverage service. Elena's appearance was carefully cultivated to project approachable competence without drawing undue attention. Her hair was always clean and professionally styled, but never elaborate. Her makeup was minimal, but present enough to suggest someone who took care of herself without being vain. Her clothing was invariably neat and appropriate, but deliberately unremarkable, the kind of appearance that allowed her to blend into any environment while maintaining the respect that came from obvious personal standards. What most people missed were the details that would have been obvious to anyone. With military training, her posture was too perfect for someone who supposedly spent her days pushing a coffee cart. Her situational awareness too acute for a civilian volunteer, her movements too economical and purposeful for someone whose biggest responsibility was remembering whether Dr. Chun preferred one sugar or two in his espresso. Elena had observed their dynamic for months, noting how they interacted with nursing staff, attending physicians, and the hospital support personnel. Mitchell tended to treat nurses as assistants rather than colleagues, often issuing instructions without bothering to ask for input or acknowledge their expertise. Brennan was more respectful but still maintained a professional distance that suggested she viewed herself as fundamentally different from the non-physician staff. Hartford was the most courteous of the three, but his extreme focus on medical details sometimes made him oblivious to the human dynamics around him. Their attitude toward hospital volunteers was particularly telling. They treated Elena and others like her with the kind of polite condescension that medical professionals often reserved for well-meaning civilians who didn't understand the complexity of healthcare. Mitchell had once commented within Elena's hearing that volunteer workers were sweet but fundamentally useless during real medical emergencies. Brennan had expressed puzzlement about why the hospital bothered with volunteer programs when they could hire additional professional staff. Instead, Hartford simply ignored volunteers entirely, unless they directly interfered with his patient care responsibilities. Elena had noticed that all three residents possessed impressive theoretical knowledge and performed well during routine cases, but she'd also observed subtle signs that suggested they might struggle during genuine crisis situations. Mitchell's confidence sometimes prevented him from asking for help when he encountered unfamiliar situations. Brennan's reliance on protocols could make her inflexible when dealing with cases that didn't fit standard presentations, and Hartford's perfectionism occasionally paralyzed him when quick decisions were required without complete information. The morning briefing took place in Conference Room B, a windowless space that smelled faintly of dry erase markers and stale coffee. Dr. Pierce reviewed the overnight census, discussed any ongoing cases that required special attention, and outlined the general staffing plan for the upcoming shift. The residents listened with the focused attention of people who understood that missing important information could have serious consequences for patient care. Mitchell dominated the discussion, asking detailed questions about complex cases and offering opinions about treatment approaches that demonstrated his extensive theoretical knowledge. Brennan contributed observations about protocol compliance and suggested improvements to workflow efficiency that showed her systematic approach to problem-solving. Hartford took meticulous notes and asked clarifying questions about medication dosages and laboratory interpretation that revealed his commitment to precision in all aspects of patient care. Elena positioned her coffee cart near the conference room entrance where residents could grab beverages before or after the briefing. She'd learned that providing easily accessible caffeine during these morning meetings was one of her most appreciated services, and it also allowed her to overhear discussions about staffing levels, patient loads, and any special circumstances that might affect the department's operations during the coming shift. As the residents filed out of the conference room, Elena noticed their usual confidence seemed slightly tempered by something Dr. Pierce had mentioned during the briefing about a regional exercise that was scheduled for later in the morning involving multiple emergency agencies. The details had been vague, but Elena's military training had taught her to pay attention to information about multi-agency coordination because it often preceded significant events. Mitchell approached her cart with his usual easy smile and characteristic assumption that everyone around him was naturally interested in his observations. "Looks like we might have an interesting morning, Elena," he said while selecting a large coffee with extra caffeine. Dr. Pierce mentioned something about emergency preparedness exercises, which usually means a lot of standing around watching firefighters and paramedics practice scenarios we could handle in our sleep. Brennan joined him at the cart, her expression more serious than Mitchell's, as she considered the implications of what they'd heard in the briefing. "Emergency exercises can be valuable learning experiences," she said with characteristic precision. "Even if we're not directly participating, it's useful to observe how different agencies coordinate their response efforts and how information flows between various command structures." Hartford approached last as always, taking time to review his notes from the briefing before addressing more immediate concerns, like caffeine procurement. "The timing seems unusual," he observed quietly. "Most training exercises are scheduled well in advance and communicated to all department heads, but this one seems to have been organized fairly quickly, which might suggest it's responding to specific intelligence about potential threats." Elena handed each of them their preferred beverages while listening to their conversation, with the kind of careful attention that looked casual but missed nothing. Mitchell's assumption that any emergency scenario would be easily manageable demonstrated exactly the kind of overconfidence that Elena had seen prove dangerous in combat situations. Brennan's focus on protocols and procedures was admirable, but Elena knew from experience that real emergencies often deviated from established plans in ways that required improvisation and flexibility. Hartford's attention to detail was valuable, but his tendency to analyze rather than act could become problematic when rapid decisions were required. 3 residents represented everything that was both excellent and potentially problematic about modern medical education. They possessed impressive knowledge, extensive training, and genuine dedication to patient care, but they'd developed their expertise in controlled environments where help was always available, resources were adequate, and the most serious challenges involved complex medical diagnoses rather than overwhelming casualty loads or resource shortages. Elena had served alongside military physicians who possessed similar credentials and had witnessed how quickly theoretical knowledge could prove insufficient when confronted with situations that exceeded normal parameters. She'd seen brilliant doctors struggle when forced to make critical decisions without complete information, operate without adequate supplies, or maintain performance standards while under direct physical threat. The transition from controlled medical environments to genuine crisis situations often revealed gaps between theoretical preparation and practical capability that could have life-threatening consequences. As the residents dispersed to begin their morning rounds, Elena continued her routine while processing what she'd observed about their readiness for anything beyond routine emergency department operations. Their confidence was both an asset and a potential liability, depending on what challenges the day might bring, and Elena's instincts were increasingly suggesting that those challenges might be more significant than anyone currently anticipated. The first signs of trouble appeared at 9:37 in the morning, when Elena noticed Dr. Mitchell arguing with Nurse Kowalski near the medication storage area. Their voices were low, but their body language conveyed the kind of professional tension that developed when competent people disagreed about important matters. Elena had learned to recognize these subtle conflicts as early warning signs that something wasn't quite right in the department's usual rhythm. Mitchell was gesturing emphatically toward a patient chart while Kowalski maintained the patient expression of someone who'd spent decades dealing with overconfident residents who thought medical school had taught them everything they needed to know about hospital operations. Elena positioned herself closer to their conversation while ostensibly reorganizing supplies on her coffee cart, a technique she'd perfected for gathering information without appearing to eavesdrop. The protocol clearly states that patients with these symptoms should receive immediate imaging. Mitchell was saying, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who believed that citing regulations would settle any disagreement. "I don't understand why there's any discussion about following established procedures." Kowalski's response was measured but firm, showing the kind of diplomatic skill that came from years of managing resident physicians who hadn't yet learned the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical hospital operations. "Dr. Mitchell, the imaging department is currently running 2 hours behind schedule because of equipment Maintenance, and we have 3 patients ahead of this one who were ordered imaging earlier. This morning we need to prioritize based on clinical urgency, rather than arrival time. Elena recognized the underlying tension immediately. Mitchell was focused on following textbook protocols without considering the practical constraints that affected real hospital operations, while Kowalski was trying to manage limited resources in a way that served all patients effectively. It was exactly the kind of conflict that Elena had witnessed countless times between new military officers who relied heavily on regulation manuals and experienced non-commissioned officers who understood how to accomplish missions despite imperfect conditions. Dr. Brennan approached the discussion carrying her tablet and wearing the expression of someone who'd been monitoring the situation from a distance. "Is there a problem with the imaging schedule?" she asked, her tone suggesting that she was prepared to offer a systematic solution to whatever organizational challenge had developed. Mitchell turned toward her with obvious relief, clearly expecting support from someone who shared his approach to medicine. "Patricia is suggesting that we delay imaging for a patient who clearly meets the criteria for immediate evaluation. I'm trying to explain that we can't simply ignore established protocols because of scheduling inconveniences." Brennan frowned as she reviewed the information on her tablet, approaching the problem with her characteristic methodical precision. "The patient's vital signs are stable, and the clinical presentation suggests a low probability of immediate complications," she said after a moment. "Perhaps we could modify the imaging protocol to accommodate the current resource constraints while maintaining appropriate clinical standards." Elena watched this exchange while noting several important details that the residents seemed to be missing. Kowalski's expression suggested that she was dealing with resource limitations that went beyond simple scheduling problems. The way she kept glancing toward the main desk indicated that she was monitoring multiple situations simultaneously, and her body language conveyed the tension of someone managing a more complex situation than the residents realized. Dr. Hartford joined the group carrying his ever-present notebook and immediately began asking detailed questions about the patient's laboratory results, medication history, and symptom timeline. His approach was thorough, but Elena noticed that he was focusing on clinical minutiae while missing the broader operational picture that was causing Kowalski's obvious concern. "Has anyone considered that the imaging delay might be related to the emergency preparedness exercise Dr. Pierce mentioned during this morning's briefing?" Elena found herself saying before she could stop herself. The words emerged with the automatic authority of someone accustomed to identifying connections between seemingly unrelated operational problems. 4 medical professionals turned toward her with expressions that ranged from surprise to mild annoyance. Mitchell looked particularly irritated at being interrupted by someone he considered peripheral to serious medical discussions. "I don't think equipment maintenance schedules are related to training exercises, Elena," he said with the kind of patronizing patience usually reserved for well-meaning civilians who didn't understand medical complexities. Elena felt a familiar surge of frustration at being dismissed by someone whose emergency experience was limited to controlled hospital environments, but she forced herself to maintain the deferential demeanor that had kept her invisible for the past decade. "Of course you're right, Dr. Mitchell," she said quietly. "I just noticed that the maintenance crew seemed unusually busy this morning and thought there might be a connection." Brennan looked at Elena with slightly more interest than she usually showed toward hospital volunteers. "What kind of maintenance activity did you observe?" she asked, her analytical mind automatically cataloging any information that might be relevant to understanding current operational challenges. The biomedical engineering team was checking all the portable monitoring equipment and the emergency power systems, Elena replied, keeping her voice casual while providing information that she'd gathered during her morning rounds. They also seemed to be testing the communication systems between departments, which struck me as more comprehensive than typical maintenance procedures. Hartford looked up from his notebook with the expression of someone who just realized that an important piece of information might have been overlooked. Comprehensive system testing usually indicates preparation for either scheduled exercises or anticipated events that might stress hospital infrastructure. He said slowly, his analytical nature overcoming his usual tendency to ignore volunteer input. Kowalski nodded with obvious appreciation for Elena's observation. "That's exactly right," she said. "We're supposed to receive notification about any activities that might affect normal operations, but the communication this morning has been somewhat fragmented, which is why I'm trying to manage imaging schedules more conservatively than usual." Mitchell's expression shifted from irritation to uncertainty as he began to process the implications of what Elena and Kowalski were suggesting. "Are you saying that we might be dealing with an actual emergency situation rather than a routine training exercise?" he asked, the confidence in his voice wavering slightly as he considered possibilities beyond his normal experience. "I'm saying that we should probably be prepared for operational challenges that might exceed normal parameters." Elena replied, carefully avoiding any display of expertise that might raise questions about her background. "In my experience working around hospitals, unusual maintenance activity and communication disruptions often precede situations that require increased flexibility in following standard protocols." Brennan was already reviewing information on her tablet, trying to correlate Elena's observations with official communications from hospital administration. The morning briefing didn't include specific details about the scope or duration of today's emergency preparedness activities, she said, which could indicate either poor communication or deliberate operational security measures. Elena recognized the signs of a developing situation that would soon exceed the normal operational capacity of the emergency department, the kind of scenario that transformed routine medical procedures into crisis management challenges. She'd witnessed similar patterns countless times in military medical facilities where seemingly minor operational disruptions often preceded major casualty events that tested every aspect of medical readiness. The residents were beginning to understand that their morning might involve more than routine patient care, but Elena could see that they were still thinking in terms of individual cases and standard protocols rather than the kind of resource management and triage decisions that characterized genuine emergency situations. Their medical training had prepared them for complex diagnoses and sophisticated treatment procedures, but not for the kind of operational flexibility that would be required if the hospital's normal support systems became overwhelmed. "Perhaps we should check with Dr. Pierce about whether there are any special preparations we should be making," Hartford suggested, his natural caution asserting itself as he began to recognize the potential for complications beyond his usual experience. Lena continued organizing her coffee cart while listening to their discussion and processing information. Through the lens of experience they didn't possess, she knew that effective crisis response required preparation that went far beyond following established protocols, and she could see that these residents, while competent in their normal roles, were about to be tested in ways that their training hadn't anticipated. Morning's routine was beginning to fracture in small ways that would soon cascade into larger challenges, and Elena found herself mentally cataloging resources and preparing for possibilities that she hoped wouldn't materialize, but that her experience told her were becoming increasingly likely with each passing moment. At 10:45, Elena was restocking her cart with fresh pastries when she noticed something that made her pause mid-motion and pay closer attention to details that would have been invisible to anyone without her particular background. 3 men in maintenance coveralls were wheeling equipment through the corridor, but their movement patterns were wrong. They walked with too much purpose, carried themselves with too much awareness, and communicated with hand signals that belonged in tactical environments rather than hospital maintenance operations. The equipment they were transporting was labeled as routine biomedical calibration devices, but Elena's trained eye caught details that didn't match the official description. One of the units had antenna arrays that were too sophisticated for typical hospital equipment, another displayed the kind of ruggedized construction that suggested military or emergency response applications, and the third was connected to communication cables that led toward the hospital's emergency command center rather than the biomedical engineering. Department Elena continued her restocking routine while tracking the men's movement through the department, using her peripheral vision and the reflective surfaces available throughout the corridor. They split up at the central nursing station, with one heading toward the trauma bays, another moving toward the triage area, and the third disappearing into the administrative offices behind the main desk. Their coordination was too precise to be coincidental, and their familiarity with the hospital layout suggested extensive prior reconnaissance. Dr. Mitchell emerged from patient room 7 looking frustrated and carrying a tablet that he was studying with obvious confusion. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to Dr. Brennan, who was reviewing charts at a nearby workstation. "I've been trying to get lab results for the past 20 minutes, but the system keeps showing communication delays that don't make any sense for routine processing." Brennan looked up from her charts with the expression of someone who was beginning to recognize a pattern of operational disruptions that exceeded normal hospital inefficiencies. "I've noticed similar problems with the pharmacy system," she said. "Medication orders that should be processed within minutes are showing extended verification delays, and the explanations I'm getting from support staff don't match the technical capabilities of our normal systems." Elena moved closer to their conversation while pretending to organize supplies on her cart. She'd learned that information gathering required positioning yourself where discussions naturally occurred and maintaining the kind of invisible presence that allowed people to speak freely without considering who might be listening. "Has anyone checked whether these system delays might be related to the emergency preparedness activities that were mentioned during this morning's briefing?" Elena asked quietly, her voice carrying just enough uncertainty to sound like someone making a tentative suggestion rather than someone who recognized the signs of a coordinated operational security exercise. Dr. Hartford approached their group carrying his notebook and wearing the expression of someone who'd been systematically documenting anomalies that were beginning to form a concerning pattern. "I've been tracking the timing of these system disruptions," he said, "and they don't correlate with any scheduled maintenance activities that were posted on the hospital's internal communication system." Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she recognized the operational signature of a major exercise or preparation for an actual emergency event, the kind of coordinated activity that preceded significant deployments or responses to credible threat intelligence. She'd participated in dozens of similar preparations during her military service and knew that the apparent randomness of system testing and equipment positioning was actually following a carefully planned timeline designed to verify readiness without creating obvious alarm. Dr. Pierce's voice echoed through the department over the public address system, requesting all department heads to report to the Emergency Command Center for an urgent briefing. The announcement was delivered in the calm professional tone that hospital administrators used when they wanted to convey important information without creating panic among patients or visitors. But Elena heard the underlying tension that suggested something significant was developing. "That doesn't sound like a routine training exercise," Mitchell said, his earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty as he began to realize that the morning's disruptions might be indicating something beyond his normal experience with hospital operations. Brennan was already accessing information on her tablet, trying to correlate the timing of the administrative briefing with the operational anomalies they'd been observing. Emergency Command Center briefings during normal operational hours usually indicate either actual emergencies or preparation for anticipated events that exceed routine hospital capacity, she said, her analytical mind processing the implications of coordinated activities that were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidental. Elena noticed movement in her peripheral vision that confirmed her growing suspicions about The nature of the morning's activities, additional personnel were arriving through entrances that were normally used only by authorized staff members. They wore civilian clothing but moved with the disciplined coordination that identified them as emergency response specialists or military personnel operating in support roles. The coffee cart gave Elena an excuse to move through the department while observing these new arrivals without drawing attention to her surveillance activities. She noted their communication equipment, their positioning near critical infrastructure points, and their obvious familiarity with hospital layouts that suggested extensive prior planning and coordination. Dr. Hartford was reviewing his notes with increased urgency as he began to recognize patterns that his methodical approach to documentation had captured. The timing of these activities suggests a coordinated response to specific intelligence rather than routine preparedness testing, he said, his voice carrying the concern of someone who was beginning to understand that they might be facing challenges beyond their training and experience. Elena found herself fighting the urge to share information that would help them prepare more effectively for what was likely coming, but revealing her knowledge would require explanations that would compromise the carefully constructed identity she'd maintained for the past decade. Instead, she continued her routine while mentally cataloging resources and preparing for scenarios that her military experience told her were becoming increasingly probable. Subtle signs were multiplying in ways that would be invisible to most hospital staff, but were unmistakable to anyone with experience in emergency preparedness. The positioning of equipment, the arrival of additional personnel, the systematic testing of communication and power systems, and the careful coordination of activities that appeared routine but followed patterns designed to verify operational readiness. Elena's hands moved automatically through her restocking routine while her mind processed tactical considerations that she hadn't needed to think about for 10 years. The hospital's layout in terms of casualty flow, the location of supply caches, the capacity limitations of various treatment areas, and the skill levels of available personnel. She found herself unconsciously developing contingency plans for mass casualty scenarios and resource shortages that she hoped wouldn't be necessary, but that her experience told her to prepare for anyway. Dr. Mitchell was becoming increasingly agitated as he tried to understand why normal hospital systems were experiencing coordinated delays that seemed designed to test backup procedures and alternative workflows. This is affecting our ability to provide normal patient care, he said. Whatever's happening needs to be resolved quickly, or we're going to have serious problems with treatment timelines. Elena recognized his frustration as the natural response of someone accustomed to working in controlled environments, where resources were adequate and systems functioned predictably. But she also knew that effective emergency response required adapting to degraded conditions and maintaining operational capability. Despite imperfect circumstances, the morning's pattern of disruptions was following a timeline that suggested preparation for either a major training exercise involving actual resource limitations or an anticipated real-world event that would test the hospital's capacity to function under emergency conditions. Either scenario would require the kind of flexibility and improvisation that Elena had learned during her military service, but that the current medical staff hadn't needed to develop during their civilian careers. As Elena continued her observations while maintaining her cover as a hospital volunteer, she realized that the morning's activities were building towards something significant that would likely reveal whether the emergency department staff could adapt their considerable medical knowledge to operational conditions that exceeded their normal experience and training. Overhead speakers crackled to life at 11:32 with an announcement that shattered the morning's carefully maintained routine. All emergency department personnel report to stations immediately. Mass casualty alert level 3. This is not a drill. Repeat. This is not a drill. Mass casualty event. Inbound estimated 37 victims with multiple trauma classifications. ETA 12 minutes. All departments implement emergency protocols immediately. The transformation was instantaneous and chaotic. Elena watched as the controlled environment of Riverside General's emergency department shifted into something resembling a military field hospital preparing for incoming wounded. The calm professionalism that had characterized the morning dissolved into urgent movement as staff members rushed to implement procedures they'd practiced but never used under actual emergency. CONDITIONSDR. Mitchell's face went pale as he processed the implications of 37 trauma victims, arriving simultaneously. His theoretical knowledge of mass casualty protocols seemed inadequate when confronted with the reality of treating more seriously injured patients than the department normally handled in an entire week. 37 victims. He repeated, his voice carrying disbelief. We don't have enough trauma bays for 37 critical patients. Dr. Brennan was already accessing emergency protocols on her tablet, but Elena could see the uncertainty in her movements as she tried to apply systematic procedures to a situation that exceeded the parameters of her normal training. We need to implement triage protocols immediately, she said, but her voice lacked the confidence she usually displayed when discussing medical procedures. The problem is that our triage training assumed much smaller casualty numbers. Elena felt her carefully maintained civilian persona beginning to crack under the pressure of recognizing a crisis that would overwhelm the hospital's current staffing and resources. She participated in mass casualty exercises during her military service and knew that effective response required leadership, experience, and tactical thinking that the current medical staff didn't possess despite their considerable clinical skills. Dr. Hartford was frantically reviewing his notes, trying to correlate the morning's operational disruptions with the current emergency, the system testing and equipment positioning we observed earlier. He said, his analytical mind working through the implications. It was preparation for this event, which means hospital administration had advance warning of a potential mass casualty situation. The public address system activated again with Dr. Pierce's voice providing initial instructions that revealed the scope of the developing crisis. All available personnel report to emergency stations immediately. We are implementing disaster response. Protocol 7. All elective procedures are suspended. Immediately all non-essential staff evacuate floors 2 through 4 to create maximum capacity for incoming trauma patients. Elena's military training was automatically processing the information and developing response strategies that her conscious mind hadn't authorized. She found herself evaluating the department's layout in terms of casualty flow, calculating supply requirements for prolonged operations, and assessing the experience levels of available personnel. Her hands were steady, but she could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat. Medical operations. Dr. Mitchell was struggling to process the transition from routine patient care to mass casualty management. His confidence replaced by uncertainty as he tried to understand how to apply his medical knowledge to situations involving resource shortages and time pressures that exceeded anything in his training. We're going to need additional medical personnel, he said. There's no way the current staff can handle 37 trauma patients simultaneously. The additional personnel are already being deployed, Elena found herself saying before she could stop herself, the words emerging with automatic authority as she processed information through the lens of emergency response experience. The maintenance personnel we observed earlier were advanced teams, positioning communication equipment and verifying infrastructure capacity. The civilian-dressed individuals arriving through restricted entrances were probably emergency medical specialists being pre-positioned for rapid deployment. The 3 residents stared at Elena with expressions that ranged from confusion to dawning realization that the quiet coffee cart volunteer had just demonstrated knowledge of emergency response procedures that seemed impossible for someone with her supposed background. Dr. Brennan was the first to voice what they were all thinking. How do you know about emergency medical deployment protocols? Elena realized that her carefully constructed cover was beginning to unravel. under the pressure of an emergency situation that triggered responses she'd spent 10 years trying to suppress. "I've worked around hospitals for a long time," she said weakly, but the explanation sounded inadequate even to her own ears as she tried to reconcile her extensive knowledge with her supposed volunteer status. The first ambulances were already arriving, as evidenced by the increased activity. Near the emergency department's main entrance, Elena could hear the distinctive sound of multiple sirens approaching from different directions, suggesting a coordinated response involving emergency services from throughout the region, the kind of multi-agency operation that indicated a major incident with casualties exceeding local capacity. Dr. Pierce's voice returned over the public address system with additional instructions that confirmed the severity of the situation. Incoming casualties include multiple traumatic amputations, severe burns, penetrating trauma, and potential chemical exposure. All personnel implement full protective protocols immediately. We are establishing overflow treatment areas in the main lobby and cafeteria space. Elena's resolve to maintain her civilian identity finally cracked as she recognized that the hospital was about to be overwhelmed by casualties requiring exactly the kind of trauma surgery and emergency medicine expertise that she'd spent 8 years perfecting in combat zones. "I need to help," she said quietly, her voice carrying new authority, as she abandoned the pretense that had defined her life for the past decade. Dr. Mitchell looked at her with confusion evident in his expression. "Elena, you're a volunteer worker. This isn't something you can help with. These are serious trauma cases requiring advanced medical intervention." "No." Elena said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "I'm not just a volunteer worker. My name is Captain Elena Vasquez, United States Army Medical Corps, retired, and I have more mass casualty experience than everyone in this department combined." The silence that followed her statement was broken by the sound of emergency vehicles arriving in rapid succession, their sirens creating a cacophony that underscored the urgency of the situation developing around them. Elena could see the shock in the residents' faces as they tried to process information that completely contradicted everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman who served them coffee twice a week. Dr. Hartford was the first to find his voice, though it came out smaller than usual. "You're a military doctor?" he asked, his analytical mind struggling to reconcile Elena's revealed identity with her behavior during the months they'd known her. "Combat surgeon," Elena corrected, "trained in forward surgical procedures, mass casualty triage, and resource management under fire. I spent 8 years keeping soldiers alive in conditions that would make this look like a training exercise." The overhead speakers activated with an urgent update that emphasized the immediate need for medical expertise. "First ambulance arriving now, Trauma Bay 1. Prepare for immediate surgical intervention. All available surgeons report to trauma stations immediately. This is the beginning of extended operations requiring maximum medical capacity." Elena looked at the 3 residents who were still processing her revelation and made a decision that would end her decade-long attempt to escape her military identity. "Right now you have a choice," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions under pressure. "You can stand here trying to understand who I really am, or you can let me help you save lives, because in about 3 minutes, this department is going to be more overwhelmed than anything you've experienced in your medical careers." Dr. Brennan recovered first, her analytical mind cutting through the shock to focus on practical considerations. "If you're really a combat surgeon, then we need your expertise immediately," she said. "But we're going to need verification of your credentials before we can allow you to practice medicine." Elena was already removing her volunteer apron, revealing scrubs underneath that she'd worn in anticipation of exactly this scenario. "My medical license was reactivated 8 months ago, specifically for emergency situations like this," she said. "Dr. Pierce will have the documentation in her office, but right now we don't have time for bureaucracy because people are about to start dying if we don't get organized immediately." The moment of truth had arrived, and Elena Vasquez was about to discover whether 10 years of hiding had cost her the skills that had once made her one of the most effective combat medics in the United States Army. The first ambulance burst through the emergency department doors with a paramedic performing chest compressions on a victim whose injuries were immediately visible, even from a distance. Elena's transformation was instantaneous and complete. The hesitant coffee cart volunteer disappeared, replaced by someone who moved with the fluid precision of a surgeon who'd spent years operating under the worst possible conditions, penetrating chest trauma with probable pneumothorax. Elena called out after a single glance at the incoming patient, her voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. He needs immediate thoracostomy and surgical airway trauma. Bay 3 has the best positioning for emergency thoracotomy. If we need to crack his chest. Dr. Mitchell stood frozen for a crucial moment, staring at Elena, as if seeing her for the first time while she was already moving toward the patient, with movements that spoke of muscle memory carved through years of emergency surgery. The paramedic looked relieved to see someone taking immediate control of a situation that was clearly beyond routine. Emergency medical intervention. Elena's hands were already assessing the patient before the gurney had fully stopped moving. Her fingers finding pulse points, checking respiratory effort, and evaluating circulation with the kind of systematic efficiency that only came from extensive trauma experience. Get me a chest tube tray and prepare for emergency intubation, she instructed Nurse Kowalski, who responded immediately to the authority in Elena's voice, despite having no idea who this person really was. You can't just start performing procedures, Dr. Brennan protested, her systematic mind struggling with the irregularity of an unauthorized person taking medical control of a critical patient. We need verification of credentials and proper authorization before allowing anyone to practice medicine in this facility. Elena looked up from the patient long enough to make eye contact with Brennan, her expression conveying the kind of patience that experienced surgeons used when dealing with administrative concerns during medical emergencies. This patient has a tension pneumothorax that will kill him in the next 4 minutes, she said, her voice remaining calm despite the urgency of the situation. You can verify my credentials after we decompress his chest, or you can explain to his family why he died while we were discussing paperwork. The second ambulance arrived with sirens wailing, carrying multiple victims from what was clearly a significant industrial accident. Elena glanced toward the new arrivals while continuing to work on her current patient, her trained eye automatically triaging the incoming casualties and assessing resource requirements. Chemical burns on at least 3 patients. She called out, we're going to need irrigation stations and neutralizing agents, which means clearing trauma bays 5 and 6 for extended decontamination procedures. Dr. Hartford was taking notes, frantically trying to document the procedures Elena was performing while simultaneously trying to understand how someone with her apparent background possessed surgical knowledge that exceeded his own training. The technique she's using for chest decompression, he said to Brennan, it's more advanced than anything we learned during residency training. Elena had inserted the chest tube with a precision that made the procedure look effortless. Despite the challenging conditions and poor lighting, the patient's breathing immediately improved and his color began returning to normal as the pressure on his lungs was relieved. He's stabilized for now, she said, but he's going to need surgical repair of the underlying lung laceration, which means getting him to an operating room as soon as possible. The third ambulance brought casualties that confirmed Elena's worst fears about the scope of the disaster. Multiple patients with traumatic amputations and severe burns that would require the kind of resource-intensive treatment that could quickly overwhelm even a well-staffed emergency department. Her military experience was automatically calculating supply requirements, surgical time estimates, and the personnel allocation needed for sustained operations. We need to implement field triage protocols immediately. Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd managed similar situations under much worse conditions. The current approach of treating patients individually isn't going to work when we have this many critical cases arriving simultaneously. Dr. Mitchell was watching Elena work with growing amazement as she moved between patients, performing rapid assessments and making treatment decisions with the kind of confidence that came from extensive experience with mass casualty situations. "How are you doing this?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine bewilderment. "The speed and accuracy of your assessments. It's like you're seeing things the rest of us are missing." Elena paused in her work long enough to provide a brief explanation that would help them understand what they were witnessing. "Combat medicine teaches you to make rapid decisions with incomplete information," she said. "You learn to recognize patterns and prioritize interventions based on resource availability and patient survivability rather than ideal treatment protocols." The 4th ambulance arrived carrying victims with complex injuries that required immediate surgical intervention. Elena's assessment was instantaneous and decisive. Multiple penetrating abdominal trauma with probable internal bleeding. She announced, "This patient needs immediate laparotomy, and we don't have time for extended diagnostic workup." Dr. Brennan was beginning to understand that Elena's knowledge represented a level of trauma experience that their medical training hadn't provided. "The way you're assessing patients," she said, "it's completely different from how we were taught to approach emergency medicine. Hospital emergency medicine assumes adequate resources and support systems." Elena replied while preparing for what would essentially be battlefield surgery in a civilian hospital. "Combat medicine assumes that everything you need might not be available and that you'll have to improvise solutions using whatever resources you can find." The 5th ambulance brought the most challenging cases, yet patients with injuries so severe that Elena's expression tightened as she recognized conditions that would test every aspect of her surgical skill and experience. She moved between the new arrivals, performing rapid triage assessments that separated those who could be saved from those whose injuries were beyond any medical intervention. "This patient has traumatic amputation of the right leg with arterial bleeding that's been controlled by tourniquet." Elena called out, her voice remaining steady despite the severity of the injuries. "We need immediate vascular surgery to save the limb, which means getting him to an operating room within the next 20 minutes. Dr. Hartford was documenting Elena's procedures with increasing amazement at the level of surgical skill she was demonstrating under chaotic conditions. "The surgical techniques you're using," he said, "they're not standard civilian emergency medicine procedures." Elena looked up from her work, briefly, her hands never stopping their systematic assessment of patient injuries. "Military surgeons learn techniques that prioritize speed and efficiency over ideal conditions," she explained. "When you're operating in field hospitals under enemy fire, you develop approaches that work with limited resources and time constraints." The emergency department had transformed into something resembling a combat surgical unit, with Elena serving as the de facto trauma coordinator. Despite having no official authority, her experience was proving invaluable in managing resources and coordinating treatment approaches that the regular hospital staff hadn't needed to develop. Dr. Mitchell was no longer questioning Elena's authority as he watched her manage multiple critical patients simultaneously with a level of competence that exceeded anything he'd witnessed during his medical training. "What you're doing," he said, "it's like watching someone who's done this hundreds of times before." "I have done this hundreds of times before," Elena replied, her voice carrying the weight of experience that couldn't be learned from textbooks. "Just not in a civilian hospital, and not for the past 10 years. The transformation was complete. Elena Vasquez had stopped hiding behind her carefully constructed civilian identity and had become once again the combat surgeon who'd spent 8 years saving lives under the worst possible conditions. Her skills had not only survived the decade of disuse but seemed to have been refined by the experience of observing civilian medical operations from the outside. The question now was whether the hospital's administrative structure would accept her unauthorized assumption of medical authority, or whether bureaucratic procedures would prevent her from continuing to provide the expertise that was clearly saving lives during the most challenging emergency the facility had ever faced. Dr. Pierce burst through the trauma bay doors at 12:15, followed by hospital administrator David Castellanos and a man in dress blues whose bearing immediately identified him as senior military personnel. Elena recognized the uniform insignia of a full colonel and felt her stomach tighten as she realized that her decade of anonymity was about to be completely shattered by someone who would almost certainly know exactly who she was and what her service record contained. Colonel's presence meant that this wasn't simply a local emergency requiring additional medical personnel. It suggested federal involvement and the kind of interagency coordination that occurred during incidents with national security implications. Elena continued working on her current patient while processing the implications of military oversight during what she'd initially assumed was an industrial accident. Dr. Pierce surveyed the organized chaos of the emergency department with expressions that cycled rapidly between amazement and confusion. Her eyes tracking the efficient workflow that had somehow emerged from what should have been overwhelming circumstances. What's the current status? She asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to receiving immediate and accurate information. During crisis situations, 31 patients processed with 6 requiring immediate surgical intervention. Elena replied automatically before realizing that she was responding to administrative inquiries with the authority of someone in charge, rather than maintaining her volunteer cover. Trauma surgeries are proceeding in operating rooms 2, 4, and 7, with estimated completion times that will allow for additional critical cases as needed. Administrator Castellanos stared at Elena with obvious confusion as he tried to reconcile her apparent command of the emergency response with his knowledge of hospital staffing and personnel. "I'm sorry, but who exactly are you?" he asked, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone discovering that unauthorized personnel had assumed control of critical hospital operations. Marcus Hendricks stepped forward before Elena could respond, his eyes studying her face with the kind of recognition that made her realize that her military service record was probably more widely known than she'd assumed. "Captain Elena Vasquez," he said, his voice carrying both respect and surprise, "although I believe your rank was actually major when you left the service 8 years ago." The correction hit Elena like a physical blow as she realized that her personnel file contained information she'd never been told about, including apparently a promotion that had been processed after her medical discharge. She'd spent 10 years believing she'd retired as a captain, unaware that the Army had recognized her service with advancement that she'd never had opportunity to acknowledge. Major Vasquez served with distinction in the 47th Combat Support Hospital and later with Special Operations medical teams. Colonel Hendricks continued addressing Dr. Pierce and Administrator Castellanos, while Elena continued working on patients. Her service record includes 3 combat deployments with commendations for battlefield surgery under extreme conditions. Dr. Pierce's expression shifted from confusion to understanding as she began to process Elena's true background and the implications of having someone with her qualifications present during a mass casualty event. "You're telling me that our coffee cart volunteer's actually a decorated military surgeon?" she asked, her voice carrying disbelief mixed with growing appreciation for the morning's events. Elena felt exposed in a way that she hadn't experienced since her discharge from military service. The careful privacy she'd maintained for a decade was being systematically dismantled in front of colleagues who'd known her only as a helpful civilian volunteer. The psychological barriers she'd constructed to separate her current life from her military identity were crumbling under the pressure of official recognition. Major Vasquez received the Combat Medical Badge, the Bronze Star with Valor, and the Army Commendation Medal for heroic medical service under enemy fire. Colonel Hendricks said, his voice carrying the formal tone used for official citations. Her expertise in mass casualty operations and combat trauma surgery was considered exemplary by every command she served under. Dr. Mitchell, who had been listening to this exchange while assisting with patient care, looked at Elena with an expression that contained both admiration and embarrassment. "We've been treating you like a volunteer worker for 2 years," he said, his voice quiet with the realization of how completely they'd misjudged her qualifications and background. Elena paused in her work long enough to meet his gaze directly, her expression softening slightly as she recognized his genuine concern. "I wanted to be treated like a volunteer worker," she said. It was easier than explaining why a combat surgeon was serving coffee instead of practicing medicine. Administrator Castellanos was reviewing information on his tablet, clearly accessing personnel files that contained Elena's reactivated medical credentials. "Your medical license shows emergency activation status," he said, "which means you're legally authorized to practice medicine in this facility during declared emergency situations." Colonel Hendricks nodded with obvious satisfaction at the administrative confirmation of Elena's status. Major Vasquez's medical credentials were maintained through the Veterans Administration medical system specifically to allow for emergency deployment during mass casualty events. He explained, her expertise was considered too valuable to lose completely despite her transition to civilian status. Dr. Pierce was beginning to understand the morning's events in an entirely new context as she realized that Elena's presence during the mass casualty event wasn't coincidental. "Were you notified in advance about today's emergency?" she asked, her voice carrying the sharp attention of someone who suspected that there were aspects of the situation that hadn't been fully explained. Elena shook her head while continuing to work on a patient with complex abdominal injuries. "I was here for my regular volunteer shift," she said. "The emergency protocols activated automatically when the incident was reported, which triggered notification systems that I wasn't aware existed." Colonel Hendricks consulted his own tablet before providing additional context that explained the federal involvement and military oversight. The incident involved a chemical processing facility with potential exposure to materials that require specialized medical treatment, he said, which activated emergency response protocols that included deployment of military medical personnel with relevant expertise. Dr. Brennan was processing this information while observing Elena's continued surgical work with obvious professional interest. "The techniques you've been using," she said, "they're specifically designed for chemical exposure and contamination, aren't they?" Elena nodded without looking up from her current patient, her hands continuing their precise work while her mind processed the implications of chemical exposure among the casualties. Military medical training includes protocols for treating exposure to chemical weapons and industrial toxins, she explained. The irrigation procedures and neutralization techniques are designed to prevent systemic absorption while treating immediate trauma. The administrative machinery was rapidly adjusting to accommodate Elena's unexpected presence and expertise. Hospital legal departments were reviewing liability issues, while medical administrators were processing the paperwork needed to officially authorize her continued practice. During the emergency situation, Dr. Pierce made the decision that Elena had been hoping for since the first casualties arrived. "Major Vasquez, you're hereby designated as acting trauma coordinator for the duration of this emergency," she announced, her voice carrying official authority. "All medical personnel are directed to follow your protocols and procedures for mass casualty management." Elena felt a mixture of relief and trepidation as she accepted official responsibility for coordinating the emergency response. Her decade of hiding was officially over, but she was finally able to use her skills openly to save lives without worrying about maintaining her civilian cover. Colonel Hendricks approached her directly, his expression serious as he prepared to deliver information that would explain the true scope of the situation they were facing. "Major, there are aspects of this incident that you need to understand before proceeding," he said, his voice carrying the weight of classified information that would change everything. The morning's crisis was about to reveal complexities that would test not only Elena's medical skills but also her ability to handle situations that went far beyond civilian emergency medicine into territory that would require every aspect of her military training and experience. Colonel Hendricks glanced around the trauma bay, ensuring that only authorized personnel were within hearing range. Before speaking in the measured tone reserved for classified briefings, Major Vasquez, the incident at Meridian Chemical Processing wasn't an industrial accident. He said, his voice carrying the gravity of information that would reframe everything they thought they understood about the morning's events. It was a coordinated terrorist attack targeting a facility that produces precursor chemicals for military applications. Elena's hands stilled for a moment as the implications registered before resuming their work with renewed urgency, her military training automatically processing the tactical and medical ramifications of treating casualties from a deliberate attack rather than an accidental exposure. How many perpetrators, and what's the current threat assessment? She asked, her voice shifting into the professional tone she'd used during classified operations briefings. 3 confirmed. Attackers neutralized, but intelligence suggests this was part of a larger, coordinated operation targeting multiple chemical facilities across the region. Colonel Hendricks replied, the chemicals involved include experimental compounds that were being developed for defensive countermeasures, but could be weaponized if improperly handled or intentionally dispersed. Dr. Pierce felt the blood drain from her face as she realized that her hospital was treating victims of what amounted to a chemical weapons attack on American soil. Are you telling us that our patients have been exposed to weapons-grade chemical agents? She asked, her voice barely controlled as she processed the implications for hospital safety and public health. Elena was already implementing additional protective protocols. Based on her military experience with chemical exposure casualties, we need to establish complete isolation for all exposed patients and implement decontamination procedures that exceed standard industrial chemical protocols. She said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd treated similar casualties in combat zones. Everyone who's had direct contact with these patients needs immediate medical monitoring. Colonel Hendricks nodded with obvious relief that Elena understood the severity of the situation. The compounds involved are experimental nerve agent precursors that can cause delayed neurological effects even after initial treatment. He explained, military medical protocols are the only treatment guidelines that address this specific type of exposure. Dr. Mitchell, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, suddenly understood why Elena's presence felt providential rather than coincidental. You're telling us that the only person in this hospital with experience treating chemical weapons exposure is someone who's been serving coffee for the past 2 years? He asked, his voice carrying disbelief at the incredible timing. Major Vasquez spent 18 months deployed with medical units that specialized in treating chemical and biological weapons exposure. Colonel Hendricks said her expertise in this specific area was considered among the best in the military medical corps, which is why her credentials were maintained in active status for exactly this type of emergency. Elena's mind was racing through treatment protocols she hadn't accessed in 10 years, remembering procedures for neutralizing nerve agent effects and managing systemic toxicity that could manifest hours or days after initial exposure. We need to start prophylactic treatment immediately for all exposed patients, she said, and implement monitoring protocols that can detect delayed neurological symptoms before they become critical. Administrator Castellanos was frantically coordinating with federal agencies and hospital legal departments as he processed the implications of treating chemical weapons victims in a civilian medical facility. What kind of resources are we going to need for extended treatment and monitoring? He asked, his voice carrying the stress of someone managing a crisis that exceeded all normal administrative procedures. Military medical supply chains are being activated to provide specialized antidotes and monitoring equipment. Colonel Hendricks replied, but the expertise required to properly administer these treatments exists in very few civilian medical facilities, which is why Major Vasquez's presence here is absolutely critical. Dr. Brennan was reviewing patient charts with new understanding as she recognized symptoms that made sense only in the context of chemical weapons exposure. The neurological presentations we've been seeing, she said, they're not consistent with industrial chemical exposure. They're showing the early stages of nerve agent toxicity. Elena nodded grimly as she confirmed Dr. Brennan's assessment. The delayed onset and specific symptom patterns are characteristic of military-grade compounds. She said, without proper treatment protocols, these patients will develop progressive neurological damage that could be permanent or fatal. The scope of Elena's hidden expertise was becoming clear to everyone present as they realized that her military medical training included knowledge that was essentially unavailable in civilian healthcare systems. Her experience with chemical weapons casualties represented specialized knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. For the current patients, Major Vasquez also holds security clearances that allow her to access classified treatment protocols. Colonel Hendricks added, the medical procedures required for these specific compounds are not published in standard medical literature for obvious security reasons. Dr. Pierce was beginning to understand that Elena's decade of hiding hadn't just concealed her medical credentials, but had hidden expertise that was literally classified at levels above civilian medical access. How long have you been carrying this knowledge while serving coffee in our hospital? She asked, her voice containing both amazement and sympathy for the burden Elena had been bearing. Elena paused in her work long enough to meet Dr. Pierce's gaze directly, her expression containing years of carefully suppressed professional identity. Every day for 10 years. She said quietly, knowing that I could help but being unable to practice medicine because of PTSD. That made normal patient care impossible, but not being able to completely walk away because this knowledge might be needed. The revelation recontextualized everything about Elena's behavior during her time as a hospital volunteer, her extensive knowledge of medical procedures, her careful observation of emergency protocols, and her positioning to respond effectively during crisis situations had all been unconscious preparation for exactly this scenario. Dr. Hartford was documenting the treatment protocols Elena was implementing with growing amazement at the sophistication of procedures that weren't available in any civilian medical textbook. These antidote protocols, he said, they're unlike anything in standard toxicology references. Military chemical weapons medicine exists in a completely separate knowledge base from civilian toxicology. Elena explained while administering specialized treatments. Elena explained while administering specialized treatments. Compounds used in weapons development require countermeasures that aren't needed for industrial chemical exposure. Colonel Hendricks consulted his secure communication device before providing additional information that explained the broader context of the attack. Intelligence indicates that this was a probing attack designed to test response capabilities and identify vulnerabilities in civilian medical infrastructure, he said, which means the expertise Major Vasquez is providing here will be critical for developing improved response protocols. The morning's crisis had revealed not only Elena's hidden medical credentials, but also her possession of knowledge that was strategically important for national security. Her ability to treat chemical weapons casualties effectively was providing intelligence about attack methods and medical countermeasures that would inform future defensive preparations. Dr. Pierce made a decision that would change Elena's life permanently. Major Vasquez, after this emergency is resolved, I want to discuss establishing a permanent position that would allow you to serve as our specialist in chemical and biological emergency medicine. She said, your expertise is too valuable to waste on volunteer coffee service. Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she contemplated returning to full medical practice. After 10 years of carefully managed distance from life and death. Responsibilities. I'll need to consider whether I'm psychologically ready for that level of responsibility, she said honestly. But today has shown me that hiding my skills doesn't make them go away. It just prevents them from being used when they're needed most. The transformation was complete. Elena Vasquez had evolved from hidden combat medic to acknowledged expert in chemical weapons medicine, but the personal cost of maintaining this expertise while living as a civilian volunteer was becoming clear to everyone who witnessed her emergence from a decade of professional anonymity. By 3:30 in the afternoon, the immediate crisis had stabilized into the controlled chaos of extended emergency operations. Elena had successfully treated 43 patients, including 17 with severe chemical exposure, who would have faced permanent neurological damage or death without her specialized knowledge. The emergency department had transformed from its normal routine into something resembling a military field hospital, with Elena serving as the acknowledged expert in chemical weapons medicine. Dr. Mitchell sat in the break room, holding a cup of coffee that had grown cold, while he processed the morning's revelations about the woman who had been serving him beverages twice a week for 2 years. I keep thinking about all the times we dismissed her observations or treated her like she didn't understand medical procedures, he said, his voice carrying genuine shame at how completely they'd misjudged Elena's qualifications and background. Dr. Brennan was reviewing Elena's mind was racing through treatment protocols she hadn't accessed in 10 years, remembering procedures for neutralizing nerve agent effects and managing systemic toxicity that could manifest hours or days after initial exposure. We need to start prophylactic treatment immediately for all exposed patients, she said, and implement monitoring protocols that can detect delayed neurological symptoms before they become critical. Administrator Castellanos was frantically coordinating with federal agencies and hospital legal departments as he processed the implications of treating chemical weapons victims in a civilian medical facility. What kind of resources are we going to need for extended treatment and monitoring? He asked, his voice carrying the stress of someone managing a crisis that exceeded all normal administrative procedures. Military medical supply chains are being activated to provide specialized antidotes and monitoring equipment, Colonel Hendricks replied, but the expertise required to properly administer these treatments exists in very few civilian medical facilities, which is why Major Vasquez's presence here is absolutely critical. Dr. Brennan was reviewing patient charts with new understanding as she recognized symptoms that made sense only in the context of chemical weapons exposure. The neurological presentations we've been seeing, she said, they're not consistent with industrial chemical exposure. They're showing the early stages of nerve agent toxicity. Elena nodded grimly as she confirmed Dr. Brennan's assessment. The delayed onset and specific symptom patterns are characteristic of military-grade compounds, she said. Without proper treatment protocols, these patients will develop progressive neurological damage that could be permanent or fatal. The scope of Elena's hidden expertise was becoming clear to everyone present as they realized that her military medical training included knowledge that was essentially unavailable in civilian healthcare systems. Her experience with chemical weapons casualties represented specialized knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. For the current patients, Major Vasquez also holds security clearances that allow her to access classified treatment protocols. Colonel Hendricks added, the medical procedures required for these specific compounds are not published in standard medical literature. Elena felt the weight of recognition settling around her like a uniform she'd tried to remove but could never completely abandon for 10 years. I convinced myself that hiding from my military identity was protecting me from having to make life and death decisions. She said, her voice quiet with the realization of how her self-imposed exile had actually worked. But today showed me that some responsibilities can't be abandoned just because they're difficult to carry. Dr. Mitchell was beginning to understand the psychological complexity of Elena's situation as he recognized the burden she'd been carrying while maintaining her civilian cover. "You've been living with knowledge that could save lives, but being unable to use it because of trauma from your military service," he said. "That must have been incredibly difficult to sustain." Elena nodded as she acknowledged the internal conflict that had defined her civilian life. PTSD made normal patient care impossible because every medical emergency triggered memories of combat casualties, she explained. "But I couldn't completely walk away from medicine because I knew that my specialized knowledge might be needed during exactly this type of crisis." Dr. Brennan was processing the implications of Elena's psychological struggle with obvious empathy. "You chose to remain connected to the medical environment while maintaining distance from direct patient care," she observed, "positioning yourself to help when your specific expertise was needed while protecting yourself from daily triggers." The coffee cart sat abandoned in the corner of the break room, a symbol of the identity Elena had constructed to maintain her connection to medicine while managing her psychological trauma. It represented years of careful balance between her need to help and her inability to practice medicine under normal circumstances. Dr. Pierce was reviewing administrative documents that would formalize Elena's new status within the hospital. "The position I'm offering would recognize your specialized expertise while providing flexibility to manage your psychological needs," she said. "Emergency consultation rather than daily patient care, allowing you to use your knowledge when it's most needed without overwhelming your coping mechanisms." Elena considered the offer while processing the day's events and their implications for her carefully constructed civilian life. 10 years ago, I thought that hiding my military identity would allow me to heal from combat trauma," she said. "Today showed me that healing doesn't require abandoning the skills that define who I am." Colonel Hendricks provided additional context that helped explain the broader significance of Elena's decision. "The expertise you demonstrated today will be critical for developing improved response protocols for chemical weapons attacks," he said. "Your knowledge represents years of specialized training that can't be replicated quickly when new physicians are needed." Dr. Hartford was documenting the lessons learned during the day's emergency response with particular attention to the differences between military and civilian medical approaches, the integration of combat medical techniques with civilian hospital resources, he noted, created treatment capabilities that exceeded what either system could provide independently. Elena's transformation from hidden coffee cart volunteer to acknowledged chemical weapons expert had demonstrated the value of maintaining connections between military and civilian medical systems. Her decade of careful observation had allowed her to understand how her specialized knowledge could enhance civilian emergency medicine when properly integrated. "The residents who worked alongside you today received training in chemical weapons medicine that would normally require years of military service to acquire," Colonel Hendricks observed. "Your ability to teach these techniques during actual emergency operations created educational opportunities that don't exist in normal training programs." Elena realized that her role could extend beyond treating chemical weapons casualties to training civilian physicians in techniques that might be needed during future attacks. "Teaching combat medical techniques to civilian doctors," she said, "could create a broader base of expertise that would improve response capabilities during chemical or biological attacks." Dr. Pierce was already considering the administrative and training implications of Elena's expanded role. "A position that combines emergency consultation with educational responsibilities," she said, "would allow you to share your expertise while building civilian medical capacity for unconventional threats." The afternoon's discussions had revealed that Elena's hidden expertise represented more than just individual medical knowledge. It demonstrated the importance of maintaining connections between military and civilian medical systems to ensure that specialized knowledge remained available when crisis situations exceeded normal civilian capabilities. Elena looked around the break room at colleagues who had spent the morning learning that their assumptions about capabilities and expertise could be completely wrong. Today taught all of us that the most qualified person in the room might be someone we never expected, she said, and that dismissing people based on appearances or current roles can blind us to resources that might be critical during emergencies. The lesson extended beyond Elena's specific situation to broader questions about how institutions recognize and utilize expertise that might be hidden beneath surface appearances. The morning's crisis had demonstrated that valuable knowledge and skills often existed in unexpected places, requiring attention and respect rather than dismissal and assumptions. 6 months later, Elena Vasquez walked through the same corridors of Riverside General Hospital, but everything had changed. She no longer pushed a coffee cart or wore the powder blue volunteer uniform. Instead, she wore scrubs with a badge identifying her as Director of Emergency Chemical Medicine, a position created specifically to utilize her unique expertise while accommodating her psychological needs and the reality that chemical weapons attacks were becoming an increasing threat to civilian populations. Coffee carts still sat in the break room, but now it was staffed by actual volunteers, while Elena spent her time developing training protocols that would prepare civilian medical personnel for chemical and biological emergencies. Her office was located adjacent to the emergency department, allowing her to respond immediately to crisis situations while maintaining the flexibility to step back when her PTSD required distance from routine patient care. Dr. Mitchell approached Elena's office carrying a case study he'd been preparing for publication in the Journal of Emergency Medicine. The protocols you developed for treating nerve agent exposure have been adopted by 12 hospitals across the region, he said, his voice carrying genuine admiration for the impact Elena's knowledge was having on civilian medical preparedness. Medical schools are requesting guest lectures about integrating combat medical techniques into civilian emergency medicine. Elena reviewed the case study with satisfaction as she saw how the morning's crisis had been transformed into educational material that would benefit medical professionals nationwide. The most important lesson isn't the specific treatment protocols, she said. It's the recognition that expertise often exists in unexpected places, and that assumptions about people's capabilities can prevent us from utilizing critical resources during emergencies. Dr. Brennan joined their conversation, carrying reports from other hospitals that had implemented Elena's chemical weapons treatment protocols. The mortality rates for chemical exposure cases have decreased significantly in facilities using your procedures, she said. But more importantly, the number of physicians trained to recognize and treat chemical weapons exposure has increased dramatically. Elena felt deep satisfaction in knowing that her painful decision to emerge from hiding had created lasting improvements in civilian medical preparedness. For 10 years, I thought that protecting myself from psychological triggers was more important than sharing knowledge that might save lives, she said. But the terrorist attack showed me that healing comes from using your skills purposefully rather than hiding from them. Dr. Hartford was documenting the broader implications of Elena's integration into civilian medicine for a research project on military-civilian medical cooperation. The educational impact has extended beyond chemical weapons medicine, he noted. Residents who trained with you during the emergency developed enhanced triage skills and resource management capabilities that improve their overall emergency medicine performance. The transformation extended beyond Elena's individual situation to systemic changes in how hospitals approached emergency preparedness. Riverside General had become a model for integrating specialized military medical expertise into civilian healthcare systems, with other facilities requesting consultation on developing similar programs. Colonel Hendricks visited regularly to coordinate between military medical systems and civilian hospitals, ensuring that specialized knowledge remained accessible for emergency response. Major Vasquez's program has identified 73 retired military medical personnel with specialized expertise who are now available for emergency consultation. He reported, creating a network of hidden expertise that can be activated during crisis situations. Elena had discovered that her experience wasn't unique. Many veterans with specialized medical knowledge had struggled with the transition to civilian practice and had stepped away from medicine rather than finding ways to contribute their expertise. While managing psychological trauma, her success in developing a flexible role had inspired similar programs at other medical facilities. Dr. Pierce reviewed quarterly reports showing the broader impact of Elena's program on regional emergency preparedness. Hospital systems across 3 states have adopted protocols based on your chemical weapons treatment procedures, she said, and the training programs you developed are being incorporated into emergency medicine residency curricula nationwide. The coffee cart had become a symbol of hidden potential rather than Elena's former hiding place. Staff members often pointed it out to visitors while explaining how the hospital's most qualified emergency medicine specialist had once served beverages, while concealing expertise that would prove crucial during the facility's greatest crisis. Elena's office walls displayed certificates recognizing her contributions to civilian emergency medicine, but also photographs from her military service. That she no longer felt compelled to hide. The integration of her military and civilian identities had allowed her to heal while continuing to serve, though in ways she hadn't anticipated during her years of psychological struggle. The residents who worked with you during the chemical attack are now training other physicians in combat medical techniques, Dr. Mitchell observed, creating a multiplier effect where your knowledge is being transmitted to medical professionals who will never serve in military environments but might face similar challenges during civilian emergencies. Elena nodded as she considered the broader implications of her decision to stop hiding her expertise. The lesson applies beyond medical knowledge, she said. Every organization probably has people whose backgrounds and capabilities are more extensive than their current roles suggest. In crisis situations often reveal resources that were always present, but not recognized or utilized. Dr. Brennan was preparing a presentation for a national emergency medicine conference about recognizing and utilizing hidden expertise within healthcare systems. Your story demonstrates that valuable knowledge often exists in unexpected places, she said, and that institutions need to create ways to identify and integrate specialized capabilities that might be concealed for personal or psychological reasons. The afternoon shift change brought new residents through Elena's office area, young physicians who'd heard stories about the legendary chemical weapons expert who'd once served coffee, but had never experienced the dismissive attitudes that Elena had encountered during her volunteer years. They treated her with automatic respect for her acknowledged expertise rather than the casual disregard she'd endured while hiding her qualifications. Elena watched the new residents with appreciation for how institutional memory had shifted to recognize rather than dismiss potential expertise. Creating environments where people feel safe revealing their full capabilities, she observed, requires more than just policies. It requires cultural changes that value hidden knowledge rather than making assumptions based on current appearances or roles. The success of Elena's program had attracted attention from federal agencies developing civilian preparedness for unconventional threats. Her expertise was being consulted for national policy decisions about medical response to chemical and biological attacks, demonstrating how individual decisions to reveal hidden capabilities could have far-reaching implications. Dr. Hartford completed his documentation with observations about the systemic lessons learned from Elena's emergence. The integration of military medical expertise into civilian healthcare systems, he concluded, represents a model for recognizing and utilizing specialized knowledge that exists within our communities but remains hidden due to trauma assumptions or institutional barriers. Elena's transformation from hidden coffee cart volunteer to acknowledged expert in emergency chemical medicine had demonstrated that healing could come through purposeful use of skills Rather than abandonment of identity, her story had become a teaching case about recognizing hidden expertise and creating flexible roles that allowed people to contribute their knowledge while managing personal challenges. As the day shift ended, Elena reflected on how the morning of the chemical attack had changed not only her life but also the understanding of everyone who had witnessed her emergence from a decade of hiding. Sometimes the most qualified person in the room is someone you've never noticed, she said, and the difference between success and failure during a crisis might depend on whether you've created an environment where hidden expertise feels safe to emerge. The lesson extended far beyond Riverside General Hospital to fundamental questions about how institutions recognize, develop, and utilize the full range of capabilities that exist within their communities. Elena's story had become a reminder that assumptions about people's limitations often prevent recognition of their greatest strengths, and that the expertise needed to solve tomorrow's challenges might already exist in unexpected places waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Have you ever wondered who around you might be carrying knowledge or skills that could make the difference during a crisis? How many qualified experts are hiding in plain sight, serving coffee, answering phones, or working in roles that don't reflect their full capabilities? What would happen if we created environments where people felt safe revealing their complete backgrounds and expertise, instead of hiding behind carefully constructed identities designed to protect them from judgment or misunderstanding? Elena Vasquez's story reminds us that the next time we face an impossible challenge, the solution might come from the person we least expect, someone whose quiet competence has been overlooked because we made assumptions about their capabilities based on their current role rather than their complete background and experience. Hit subscribe if this story made you think differently about the people around you, and leave a comment telling us about a time when you discovered that someone had capabilities you never suspected. What hidden expertise might exist in your workplace, your community, or even your own family, waiting for the right moment to emerge and make a difference? Share this story with someone who might be hiding their own expertise and ring the notification bell so you never miss these powerful reminders that extraordinary people often disguise themselves as ordinary, and that the most important knowledge sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. We'll see you tomorrow with another story that reveals the heroes hiding among us every single day. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.